So you work for a company called Intuitive Machines, and I was looking them up a little bit, and it sounds like their mission is to get like a unmanned payload to the surface of the moon. Is that correct? Is that what you guys are working on?
Yes, that is correct. That's our primary objective right now.
Okay.
And so, so what we've kind of some history, I guess, with Intuitive Machines, because I think
Yeah.
it'll kind of guide the company and what its objectives are.
Yeah.
So it was started by two guys, or I guess essentially three guys, two of them from NASA.
Okay.
So Tim Crane and Steve Artemis. And essentially they left NASA to create their own company. And their original company was, their thoughts was, well, let's apply what we have learned and what we did from in the space industry just to other aspects of life. And so really what they were doing was just building autonomous machines, hence intuitive machines.
Okay.
But I mean, they would do things like drills. Their biggest focus was like drones. But then NASA came out with with their CLIPS program, which is kind of this branch off or this supporting branch of for the Artemis program of building the lunar base.
Okay.
So they were going to award companies essentially funding to build these unmanned payload vehicles in hopes that they could utilize them to bring equipment to the moon to start building these lunar bases and whatnot. And to kind of kickstart a lunar economy, really mostly. And at that point, the founders of the company said, hey, this is right up our alley, and shifted their focus to be solely a space-focused company.
Interesting.
So they really pivoted there and won the contract, won two of the CLIPS programs, actually I think three contracts. And so, our primary focus right now is those payloads for the moon.
And that's all kind of directed by NASA. Like NASA is the one that's trying to, the Artemis program, is that what you said it's called?
The Artemis program. Yeah, they're a major funder in that regard. But like the payload landers themselves, theoretically, will move more towards a self-sustaining platform. So the idea is that people will pay to put payloads on these and move them and take them to the moon. And so even for those three missions, we have different people lined up who are paying to take their stuff to the moon, whatever it be, whether it be science, projects or whatnot, from universities to government and whatnot.
Okay. Yeah, because I remember someone was talking to me maybe like a year ago, and they were saying something about this lunar mission trying to go to the moon. And I was like, I'm not sure that's correct. I don't think we're going to the moon. And so I just had no idea that the NASA was even focused on like a lunar project. So I guess my question is like, what is the big push to go to the moon? Like I've heard of Mars, and I guess I haven't heard a lot of things, but the lunar project, like, is the main goal scientific research? Is it to get people like living on the moon, like habitating the moon? Is it like a waypoint that we can then go from the moon to Mars? Like do you know what like the big overall objective with the lunar project is, I guess?
Yeah, it's probably dependent on who you ask, what the objective is, because I think everyone has their own, objectives in mind.
Yeah.
But a big one is just kind of a push for humanity, pushing humanity forward. And so I think especially if you put it as like thinking about it as the future of humanity, right? Right now, we're very dependent on Earth.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So if something was to go awry, and we're getting increasingly better at allowing global shifts in the world itself, nuclear wars or whatnot, or even just global warming, you can talk about that and say, well, humankind's getting more and more capabilities of being able to rapidly transform their global environment.
Yeah.
And is there a point where where we can't reverse it, or it's a chain reaction and things go south fast? And so if you look at it just from that perspective, and you think about how long it takes to become an interplanetary species,
Yeah.
it's you can't decide that you're going to become an interplanetary species overnight. And so you need to focus on it early on. And so there's that interest itself, but then there's just, I think, just the interest in the unknown innovation that occurs, right? And so if you think about like the space program in the past and what it's brought to us, I mean, satellites are a big one that we use every day, all day today. It's such a fundamental part of our lives.
Yeah.
And we don't even think about it. All became possible through space exploration.
Yeah.
And so
It's true.
a big question is just like, what else is out there as we move forward, try and innovate?
Do you feel like the kind of the arena of space exploration is moving more private versus more government? And I guess what is NASA's role as we have these new companies start up? I was also under the impression there weren't a ton of aerospace companies, but since living in Houston, I'm realizing there are a lot more than I realized. I thought it was just like SpaceX and NASA.
Yeah, no, there's quite a few. I mean, there's like the big dogs like SpaceX, and then Blue Origin, which is
Yeah,
Jeff
that's right.
Bezos,
Yeah.
and then Virgin Galactic.
Okay.
And so there's the bigger companies, and then there's kind of the mid companies, which I'd call like Firefly, Axiom's getting there.
Okay.
And then there's smaller companies that are up and running, and who's to say how many of them are going to live or how many of them are going to die out? But I mean,
Yeah.
it is exciting though that you are getting a push of the space industry into the private sector, right?
Yeah.
And so, I don't think anyone knows how it's going to fall out, but we have certainly seen more innovation in the last 10 years than we did in the last 50 years prior to that. To no fault of anyone, I would say. I just think that government funding is geared a lot towards public perception and public interest. And so in a Cold War, when, people had this mentality of, oh, we've got to beat the Soviet Union,
Yeah.
a lot of money gets dumped into it. And then once people think that, we won that race, they just lose interest, and no one really pays attention to it. And because there's like no immediate benefit that they see from it, right? Kind of like the questions you just asked. It's like, oh, what do we do out there,
Do you feel like it's still like the race mentality that's driving aerospace companies now? Like first person to get back to the moon, first person to get to Mars, first person to build a space colony. Like, is it still kind of like a just do it to be the first one that does it kind of thing? Or are there kind of deeper motives behind it, do you think?
I think that is probably the main reason why the government's willing to fund things like it. I would argue though that it's not the reason why the private sector's in it, right? Because people like Elon Musk is not in it to be the first.
Yeah.
If there's a lot of interviews with him where he talks about like, hey, we're already so far in life and we're not an interplanetary species. Like, come on, like it's been 50 years since, all this other stuff and we haven't done much with it.
Yeah.
And so I think on the private side, it's more of a passion of the innovation. But certainly I think what's enabling that from government funding is a competitive nature, especially with China.
Like the U.S. wants their name on the team that goes to Mars, for example.
Yeah, well, and yeah, that's a fair way of putting it.
Interesting. Yeah, do you think that NASA will kind of like fall to the wayside almost? Like I was talking with someone else recently about just the kind of parallel between like the United States Postal Service and like Amazon, for example. Like used to be if you wanted to send a package, it had to go through the USPS. But nowadays, if you want overnight shipping, like, I mean, the ones who have maximized overnight shipping is the private sector, and the like government mail system is not super incentivized to innovate or be competitive in that sense? Do you feel like NASA will almost take like a back seat, or do you think it'll just turn into just like a funding machine where it just sends money to these private companies, or do you think NASA will always be like a central innovative like force in the aerospace world?
Yeah, it's certainly up for speculation, right?
Yeah.
Because everyone's wondering. I would say I would say NASA's probably headed more towards like an FAA type seat in the space industry, where we'll start seeing them take more of a regulatory role,
Hmm.
and certainly like a funding role early on, right? And so, so something I actually learned just a couple of years ago that was really interesting was, like cargo planes.
Hmm.
Um, Initially, what really got them up and running was government funding, government projects to get them moving.
Hmm.
But now the private industry has kind of learned to adopt and utilize them, that they're self-sufficient. And I
Hmm.
think that that's what the end hope with like the space industry would be, is as private industry kind of finds its use for this new field or this new arena, the funding will not need to be as intense from the government or solely funded by the government,
Yeah.
and the space industry will kind of find a self-sustaining
Hmm.
existence.